So I'm going to tell you a pretty long story today about something that means so much to me. Oh my God. It's about the time that I got to hang out with John Lennon when I was a teenager for almost a whole evening. And words kind of fail me. I don't talk about it very much because I don't want people to think I'm showing off when I tell the story. But, it was such an extraordinary thing to have happen. So this story is a little bit long. So if you're not interested in John Lennon or the Beatles, it doesn't matter. You don't have to listen, obviously. But if you do like the Beatles and you like John Lennon, stay and you can hear some pretty fun stuff here. So when I was a very little girl, maybe 5 years old, my parents had a friend who was a very famous art critic named Clement Greenberg. And we were living in Tokyo, Japan, and he came to visit us. And he brought us 3 record albums. The first one was Bob Dylan's record, Highway 61 Revisited, which our cook, who was a very strict Japanese woman, quickly grabbed it out of my hands as I was looking at it and said, "You can't have this album." She didn't like the way Bob Dylan looked, but I liked the way he looked at me, and I thought, we have an appointment later, maybe. So the second album was the Rolling Stones, and she said their hair is too long and took that album away. And then the third album was Meet the Beatles, and she kind of grudgingly let us keep it. And it was red vinyl. It was really cool. I wish I had it now, but oh my God. I've listened to it so many times, completely scratched up. It got thrown away years ago. Anyway, I had a little square turquoise blue record player with sparkles on it. And I would carry this record player around with me everywhere and plug it into the wall. And my first obsession was Beethoven. And I listened to Beethoven all the time. From the time I was about 3 years old, I had one Beethoven record. Couldn't stop listening to it. And then I got obsessed with the Beatles. So I loved them. And when I was about 6 or 7, maybe, the Beatles came to Tokyo. And we begged our parents to take us to go see them. And my father did get tickets. He said, I got them on the black market. And we had to behave for 3 weeks without doing anything wrong in order to keep the tickets and go. Anyway, I can still see the tickets. They were white with big black letters on them. And so eventually, my sister and I and my mother went to the Beatles concert. And it was outrageous. Every single person in the stadium was probably a young Japanese woman. And every single one of them was sobbing into a towel, just sobbing the whole way through the show. And I had a little bit of poison ivy on my arm right here. And so everybody kept saying, wave to the Beatles. And I would go like this because I didn't want them to see my poison ivy, even though we were pretty far away. Anyway, big love affair. Had a big crush on Paul, who I think was maybe not the coolest Beatle to have a crush on. But anyway, so that was that. So years later, we moved to Washington, D.C. And I had a friend whose father was the Bishop of New York. And his name was Paul Moore. And he was helping John Lennon and Yoko stay in the country when they got arrested for having pot, marijuana. And so one night, I think I was probably around 13 or 14 years old, they came to a party at my friend's house. So news went around the neighborhood pretty quickly that John Lennon was going to be coming to the party. But of course, I knew in my heart of hearts that nobody loved the Beatles as much as I did. I was their biggest fan. And so we were so excited. So we went to the party early, and me and a couple of my friends stood on the front porch of the house. If you want to know, it was on the corner of Newark and 34th Street in Cleveland Park. Big stone kind of house with a big stone front porch. And we stood on the porch waiting. We wanted to be the first ones to see John Lennon when he got there. And a big black limousine rolled up. And sure enough, John Lennon and Yoko came out of the limousine, came up the steps. And they said, "Oh, you're the greeting committee." And we were like, "Oh, yeah." And he had on that blue velvet suit, that dark blue velvet suit you sometimes see him in. And he had his little round glasses. And Yoko had her beautiful black hair, streaming down with sort of a curtain across her face, wearing dark clothes. And we greeted them, brought them into the house. And, the party was in full swing. There were probably about 100 people there. And I was trying to be cool, like my older friends. And I went up to the barman and I said, "Can I have a gin and tonic?" Because I thought that's what grown-ups drink. I don't think I'd ever had a drink before in my life. And he gave me one. And then he gave me another one. I don't know how many I had, but had a few. And I was only 14, I think, so I wasn't whatever. So then I went up to John Lennon and just started talking to him. And I said, "I saw you at Budokan." And he was like, "What? You're too young to be a Beatles fan." And I was like, no, you don't understand. I've loved you my whole life. And he was so kind to me. I mean, incredibly nice to me. He focused in on me. He asked me questions about what I was interested in. Why did I live in Japan? Where did I go to school? What did I do now? I mean, he was super focused on me. And maybe at a party where there were a lot of grown-ups who were probably in awe of him, maybe it was easier to focus on a kid. I don't know. But at one point, he was smoking these Gauloises, these blue Gauloise cigarettes. And I said, "Can I have one?" And he was like, "Oh, do you smoke?" And I don't know if I said yes or no, but I took it from him and I put it in my pocket. And he was like, "Why are you putting that in your pocket?" And I was like, "I was going to keep it as a souvenir." And he said, "You want a souvenir?" And I was like, "Yeah." And so he reached his hand into his pocket and he pulled out a pocket full of change. There were guitar picks. There were these shiny kind of buttons that had like rhinestones in them. And I felt like I was at some kind of store where I got to go shopping for something that I wanted. And so I picked out a guitar pick and he said, "Do you want something else?" And I was like, "Well, sure, I'll take a button." So I took a button and he was like, "Do you want anything else?" And the buttons were all kinds of pretty colors. So I took a turquoise button. You can probably tell I'm obsessed with that color. And I took a red button and I took a guitar pick. And he said, "Are you happy now?" And I said, "Yes." And I put those in my pocket. And then he said, "Now we can have a regular conversation because you don't need a souvenir anymore." And we kept talking. And then a group of us got it into our heads that we wanted him to autograph our arms with a ballpoint pen. So we took this part of our arm right here, and he signed his name for all of us. And then he gave us each a 45 that he had just produced with his wife, with Yoko. It was called "Woman is the N Word of the World." And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Oh, you'll understand someday." And it was apparently a quote from Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which turned out to be a book that I not only loved, I've taught it for many years in school. Anyway, so then he gave us this 45, and then shortly thereafter, his manager came up to him and said, "We need to go now." And I saw this look of kind of almost panic come into his face. And he said, "Where's the door?" And the manager pointed at the front door and said, I'll help you get there." And so his focus had completely changed. And I realized he was frightened about the idea of getting to the door, that somebody might try to stop him. Because of course, I mean, he's John Lennon. People probably would have tried to get his attention. And I said, "Can I have a kiss?" And Yoko was standing right there. And he said, "No, you can't, because Yoko gets very jealous." And she smiled at me and winked at me. And then he gave me a little hug. And then I saw his back going towards the door, and he was gone. So that was just kind of amazing. And then years later, I was in college in New York City, and I used to sometimes get sort of lonely for Japan. And there was a store on 57th Street that was a Japanese store. And sometimes I would go in there just to look at Japanese things. I really missed Japan. I really identified as being Japanese more than American my whole life. And I went in the store, and I ended up going into the back of the store, and I noticed that there was a staircase going up, and it said there was a restaurant upstairs. And I thought, well, I could go there. I could look at that. And I went to the top of the stairs. This must have been 1978, maybe 1979. And I went to the top of the stairs, and it was pitch black. So there was, nothing was going on. I don't think anybody was being served anything. And the whole room was filled with smoke. And there were windows against the street. And then I saw that there were two people sitting at the table smoking. And it was dead silence. And they looked at me, and I looked at them, kind of like animals encountering each other in the jungle or something. And I realized it was John and Yoko. And I just looked at them for a minute, and they looked at me, and then I turned around and went back down the stairs. And that was the end of that story. When John Lennon was shot and killed in New York City in 1980, my then husband walked into the kitchen. I was holding my brand new baby in my arms. And when he told me what happened, it felt so personal. Not only because I'd met John Lennon, but because he lived so close by, right in the Dakota, up there on the Upper West Side. And so I put my baby in the stroller, and I walked to the Dakota. Just a long, long walk from where I lived in the East Village. And we stood outside the building and just, I guess we said prayers. It was a sort of homage, a sacred walk to go up there. Thank you for listening if you made it to the end.